Thank you. Your passcode is confirmed.
What you can do if you have supplier information and performance management, what you can do without supplier information and performance management, and what you can do with SLP. So we'll kind of take a brief look at all of the different supplier solutions that Ariba offers and how registration works within each of those. We'll start with an overview of supplier registration. It's the first step to enable suppliers using, if they're going to be using SAP Ariba sourcing, contracts, or SIPM. In order for them to participate in sourcing or contracts, they need to be registered and they need to have a user, which we'll learn in a little bit. Also, the process that you're going to see varies based on the solutions that you have purchased. So there's more control over approvals and process with supplier information management. It gives you a Supplier Workspace template and allows you to customize approval flows for the approval of new supplier registration. Without that, there's less control. Without supplier information management, there's less control over how those approvals will be obtained. Without SIPM, one group is required to approve all supplier organizations. The permissions that are required within this particular module or that relate to supplier registration are Supplier Customer Manager, Supplier Customer Agent, and Supplier Customer User Agent. Each one of these permissions has different abilities. The Supplier Customer Manager is kind of the overall user. They're the manager of the agents and the user agent. They can create approved organizations. So as we see through the webinar, we'll talk about manual creation of suppliers. And those users with Supplier Customer Manager permission will have the ability to create approved organizations. And so will Supplier Customer Agent. The only difference is the Supplier Customer User Agent does not have the ability to create approved organizations. They must obtain approval from someone else within the organization before that organization can be invited to a sourcing event or used in a contract workspace. So the registration methods, there are three kinds, three: self-registration, manual creation, and creation through your ERP. So self-registration is the first method we're going to talk about, and that is the most effective method of registration for suppliers. Vendors will register directly in the Ariba network and on your site, so they'll create both of those profiles at once, and we'll learn what that means as we go through. They must answer profile questions and cloud profile questions. So the profile that the supplier will complete during this registration process is twofold. The first profile that they have to complete is for the Ariba Commerce Cloud or the Ariba network. That is a profile that they will create that registers them within the Ariba network and is available to all Ariba customers. The second part of that registration is where they'll register directly with your company through the Supplier Profile Questionnaire. So you can ask specific questions in the Supplier Profile Questionnaire so that the supplier responds to those particular questions during their registration process. After they answer those questions, you can then approve that organization if they meet your requirements. The second method is manual creation. This is where someone within your organization will create the supplier organization rather than the supplier registering themselves as an organization. The creation of these particular supplier organizations will either be approved or unapproved based on those user permissions that we talked about. So if you're a Supplier Customer User Agent, you actually don't have the ability to create an organization. If you're a user agent, you only have the ability to manage users within existing organizations. Supplier Customer Agents require approval. Supplier Customer Managers can create approved organizations. When you manually create a supplier, this supplier is private. It only exists on your site until that link to the Ariba Commerce Cloud happens. And that link is going to happen with a manually created supplier when they're invited to the site, which can either be when you create the supplier or when they're invited to an event or a contract. At that point, they'll receive an invitation email asking them to link their account to the Commerce Cloud as well as to your site so that they can participate in any events that you've invited them to. Manual creation, you can see here, it's used mostly for SAP Ariba contracts where you're going to create that organization and there won't be any users inside of it. Because users, you don't need any users for a contract, you only need users so that they can participate in an event. So for sourcing suppliers, it's helpful to have them self-register, so that way the user information is already created. Whereas for a contract, that supplier may not ever access your Ariba system because you're just creating that organization as a placeholder to indicate who this contract is with. And then lastly, suppliers can also be created by a feed from your ERP system, so it's possible to configure some files so that any organizations that you have in your ERP system can be manually or automatically fed into Ariba and created there. So those are the three main methods of how we can register the suppliers. We're going to take a look at those methods. We'll take during the demo, we're going to look at self-registration and how the supplier can self-register and how that works. We'll also take a look at manually creating a supplier organization.
Randy?
Yeah.
There's one question that came in. Would you like to go ahead and answer right now, or would you like to go ahead and wait? Okay. So the question came in, and he says, we have SIPM, sourcing and contract, and PTP, P as a Peter, TP, but not using upstream. We create supplier from SAP to PTP. Now we want to use upstream modules. Still, shall we use a supplier created for PTP? That's the question.
Okay, so it sounds like, I'll summarize that question. So it sounds like you have suppliers already created for the P2P applications. You're using them with invoicing and things like that. Now you're going to deploy on the upstream solutions like sourcing and contracts and things like that. And so you're questioning how will you get your suppliers registered for sourcing. And so if your site is suite integrated, so if you have it integrated with your upstream and downstream solutions, the suppliers that you already have created from your P2P application will already exist in your sourcing application as a common supplier. If not, if you don't have that integration, then you will create them separately in your upstream solution site.
Okay. There two more questions came in here. So the first one is, can supplier self-register for Ariba SLP? Is bi-directional feed enabled for SLP?
So we'll talk about SLP in a few slides, but self-registration is not currently available in SLP.
Okay. And the last one I have is, could you please explain and demo between self-registration options, which is cloud, passive, full, active, or directed?
So those are definitely 3 or 4 types of self-registration. They are all different methods, and they all have different implications on how they will register on the cloud. However, this webinar is about best practices. And so the best practice for self-registration using self-registration is to do the full directed. So we're only going to be demoing that particular method where you give the supplier the URL to register, or they click on the register as a new supplier link, that they're creating a link both between the Ariba network and your customer site. We have other methods of registering that are not as conducive to setting up that business relationship, because some of the other methods, there's one that will only register a supplier on the Ariba network and not with your customer site. So they basically create a cloud profile, but you won't be able to find them within your site through that method of registration. And so since your goal is to not get them into the Ariba network, the goal is to get them on your site. The full directed registration that we'll be going over in this particular webinar will be the full directed pull.
Great. Thank you so much, Randy. Okay, that's all I have for now. So.
Okay. All right, so we'll continue on and we'll talk about supplier registration without SIPM. So if you do not have supplier information and performance management, the options that we recommend as a best practice would be to configure, first of all, the email template. So when a new supplier is registered, they can still self-register if you don't have supplier information and performance management, but you can configure the email template so that when they're sent, they are customized to have specific instructions for your organization as to what they need to do. Supplier agents will create and supplier managers will approve. At least that's our recommendation. Anyone that has the supplier agent permission will be able to create the supplier organization, and then anyone with the supplier manager permission will be approving those newly created supplier organizations. We also recommend to use supplier approval, reject, and submit for reapproval. So when you are working within a supplier workspace, within an organization, you have the option to reject a supplier organization. So let's say some of the answers that they've given in the profile questionnaire don't necessarily meet the needs of your organization. You can reject that, and then you can also allow them to submit for reapproval. So you can send that back to them. They can go back through and revise their responses and resubmit it for approval. Also in sourcing, you can use Ariba Discovery to search for new suppliers. So if you've got an event where you've got your supply base, but you want to find new suppliers, see if there are new suppliers out there, if there's a new supply base that you can contact or invite to this particular event, you can use Ariba Discovery to locate new suppliers and invite them into your event within sourcing. Also, we recommend configuring a set of general questions in the supplier profile questionnaire. So the supplier profile questionnaire should have a series of questions that provide you with the basic requirements that the supplier has. So these questions should address what your basic needs are. What do you need from the supplier in order to be able to work with this particular supplier? And there's a whole separate webinar on managing and maintaining the supplier profile questionnaire. So if you want more information on how to work with that and what types of things to include and how to configure the profile questionnaire, there's another webinar on that.
Randy,
yeah.
I'm sorry. A couple more questions came in, so just let me know
Okay.
when you can answer. Are you ready?
Sure.
Okay. If supplier exists on P2P and we create suppliers manually for SLP/sourcing, will that create duplicate records or issue within the P2P module? In other words, will the P2P module have duplicate supplier records?
That depends on if your site is suite integrated. So if you have your P2P applications working along with your sourcing and contract solutions, then those supplier organizations will be shared between the two.
I see. Okay. Okay. And the next one is, can supplier managers bypass any approval workflow setup at the template level and approve the supplier organization?
I'm not sure I understand the question. So if a supplier manager creates a supplier, they have the ability to approve that supplier. So it wouldn't be sent for approval in the first place because they're a supplier manager and they can create that supplier as approved. If a supplier agent is creating that organization, the supplier manager will be able to approve.
I see. Okay. I'll go ahead and contact the person who is asking this question and, just try to make sure.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Right, so in summary, basically supplier registration without SIPM is going to be very basic. So there's a permission, the supplier agent can create the organizations, the supplier managers can approve those organizations. But it's basically just those permissions. Whereas supplier registration with SIPM, you get a whole bunch more things. So you get what's called a supplier workspace. And that supplier workspace has a task tab where you can configure an onboarding process flow where you've got a number of tasks to onboard that particular supplier, but then you can also have complex approvals. So rather than just assigning particular users the supplier manager permission to approve newly registered organizations, you can actually set up a complex approval flow. So for example, if you have a different set of approvers in North America than you do in South America, you can set a rule so that when a supplier registers and they select their region as North America, the North American supplier approver group is added into that approval flow. So with SIPM, you can have a lot more control over who is approving what and kind of delegate out those responsibilities. So rather than sending the approval notification to every single supplier approver, only the approvers that need to know about this particular organization can be approved when you're doing registration using a supplier workspace. Also, if you have supplier information and performance management, you're going to get something called a qualification project. That qualification project can be used in conjunction with the supplier profile questionnaire. if you do have SIPM and you do have access to supplier qualification projects, we recommend that you use those as further qualification, obviously, since it's a supplier qualification project. So the SPQ should be the bare minimum, the basic questions that you need to at least entertain the idea of doing business with this particular supplier. If they pass that round of questions, there may then need to be a supplier qualification project where you're going to then further qualify that supplier, whether it be for a particular service or commodity. For example, if you have a direct supplier, a direct commodity supplier, you might want to put them through further questioning to make sure that the commodities they're providing is up to your standards. So you could have an SQM project, a supplier qualification project, to ask those further qualifying questions. So that way we're not bogging down all of the other suppliers that may or may not have anything to do with this particular commodity in the SPQ. We're not making them answer questions that don't pertain to them. Instead, we have a supplier qualification project that's on the Documents tab of their Supplier Workspace to see that, okay, not only is a supplier approved to come into Ariba, they're also qualified for this particular commodity through a supplier qualification project. Then also with SIPM, there are supplier performance projects. That doesn't have a whole lot to do with the registration process. This is more about performing their performance once they are measuring their performance once they've registered on the site and once they've been approved. So that would be after the registration process that you have those SPM projects. Same with the task and project recurrence. Those are all related to managing the supplier afterwards, not so much towards the registration. The biggest point with SIPM is that you get the supplier workspace and a configurable workflow where you can also customize the approval flow. So that way, if you have very specific requirements on who needs to approve certain organizations, you can use the supplier workspace to mirror that process that you have within your organization. Without SIPM, you basically have two groups that can create, one group that can create and one group that approves, without any personal configuration there. Okay, the supplier profile questionnaire, this is available in all solutions, but more robust functionality is available when you subscribe to Supplier Information Management and configure that in conjunction with the Supplier Workspace. So as I mentioned, the questions in the SPQ should be general and apply to all suppliers. We also have a multi-stage SPQ. This is where the initial stage provides screening questions for simple onboarding, and then a secondary stage to provide more targeted questions. That secondary stage would be based on condition. So this would be, you can use those conditions if you don't have SIPM, because then you can't create the SQM or SPM project to sort of follow up on those. So you can definitely set up conditions. Sorry, I'm looking at what's going on in the chat. It's not focused on that. So if you wanted to, or if you don't have SIPM and you're using the SPQ, you can use visibility conditions on the SPQ to have multiple sections, and those sections will only appear when they apply. So that way you can use the supplier profile questionnaire, the SPQ, for many things. But it's easier when you have SIPM, of course, because then you can have an SQM project in your SPQ, the Supplier Profile Questionnaire, is only used for general onboarding questions for all organizations, and then you can determine if an SQM project is needed for this particular supplier. So with SIPM, further, we've got our qualification project. This is a more specific qualification process using Supplier Qualification Management project. And it's a qualification for a particular product or service, or for environmental, social, or risk requirements. So if there's something additional that you need to qualify a particular supplier for beyond what you're asking in the SPQ, that's what a qualification project can do for you. And that can be part of the registration process as well. So even though they've registered on Ariba and they've registered on the Ariba Commerce Cloud, they still might need to do a little bit more registration with your organization to make sure that they're approved to do business for that particular commodity, for that particular environment, or risk requirement. Okay, this slide, not going to spend too much time going over this because this is mostly just about SPM projects and how they work. It is important to know that, but it does not have much to do with supplier registration, because at the point that you have an SPM project, a supplier performance management project, the supplier has already been approved and registered. At this point, we are just managing their performance through an SPM project. But it's important to know that it exists out there, because after they're registered, you should still maintain their performance through SPM if available. So in supplier lifecycle, talk about that a little bit. It's a new solution. It has to be purchased and enabled. Supplier registration is handled through surveys. The supplier profile questionnaire does not exist. So in SLP, there is no supplier profile questionnaire. All of the registration, the supplier profile questionnaire, everything is handled through the use of surveys in the supplier lifecycle solution. Each survey can be associated with its own approval flow. So the survey kind of works as an SDQ, except now instead of only being able to have one, you'll be able to have multiple surveys that address multiple different situations. So you could have one for Europe, you could have one for North America, you could have one for different regions, different questions for registration purposes. You could also set it up by commodity. So different commodities could have different questions for registration. Also within SLP, there's native integration with SAP ERP. So it's actually built into the user interface that you integrate with your SAP ERP system. And specifics about this integration can be found in the setting up SAP Ariba Supplier Management extended functionality and setting up SAP Ariba Supplier Lifecycle and Performance Guides, which are available in the site if you have access to it. Otherwise, you can go to connect.ariba.com and search for that documentation there as well. That'll provide you with more technical information on the integration. Okay, there are some new user groups with SLP. There's a supplier request manager, supplier registration manager, supplier qualification manager, and preferred supplier manager. The little T's or the little U's afterwards indicate whether these permissions are key member permissions or user permissions. So the supplier request manager is a key member, not a user. But all supplier creation is handled through a new project type called a supplier request, kind of like a contract request or a sourcing request, if you're familiar with that functionality at all. But it's the type of project that sends out the request for a new supplier. Once that request is approved, that supplier organization gets created. So there's no more process of creating a supplier. In this case, it's going to be more of approving the registration through a survey. And then also there's no self-registration. And this is just a brief view since we won't be demoing SLP. You can have a screenshot here. This is a screenshot of a vendor in registration in SLP. You can see that they have some tasks pending and then any questionnaires that might be sent out. You can have multiple questionnaires here, and this actions menu will allow you to send the questionnaires, whichever questionnaires apply. So you can have multiple questionnaires here and then choose which ones are going to be sent to this particular vendor through the supplier request. Okay, and then before the demo, we'll go through some best practices. We recommend that you use a multi-staged SDQ with a simple first stage, which is just basic questions about basic requirements. And then if you need to get into more detailed requirements, if you don't have SIPM, you can use visibility conditions to add additional requirements in the SDQ where applicable. Or if you do have SIPM, you can create SQM projects to follow on to further qualify that particular supplier. So the next point is add an SQM project to your Supplier Workspace template under appropriate conditions, such as commodity or region, to further qualify a supplier who requires a lengthier onboarding process. And that's, again, if you have SIPM. After a supplier is fully vetted and approved, you can create an SPM project to monitor their performance periodically to make sure that they're still performing at the level that you expect. And again, that's if you do subscribe to Supplier Information and Performance Management. You can also create SQM projects for corrective action plans if the supplier is not meeting those expectations. So even after you register them, you can still modify or monitor their performance or ask them quality questions or qualification questions through an SQM project to make sure that they're still performing where you need them to be performing. And then replace suppliers that are not meeting your goals by using these registration processes, whether that's going out to discovery to find new suppliers or just sending them back through a series of questions to see if anything has changed about their qualification. If you're creating organizations manually, use the naming convention so that it's easy to search for and identify duplicates. So when organizations are created manually, there is a parameter that will prevent you from creating a supplier with a name that already exists, but it's also possible that things can be spelled differently, or somebody might use an abbreviation versus the actual name of an organization, in which case duplicates can happen there. Also, we recommend that you use self-registration wherever possible. So if you are registering suppliers to participate in sourcing events, it's easier if you ask them to self-register rather than you sending out a link for them. And then also invite them to register when there is actually a business opportunity for them. A lot of times customers will send out mass invitations for suppliers to come in and register on their site so that they have their entire supply base available on the site all at once. If the supplier doesn't have any sort of vested interest in updating this profile information for you, if there is no opportunity for them at this current time, then there's no real incentive for them to spend the time to update their profile. So make it attractive for them if you are going to invite them. If there is not a current activity and you do just want them to register on your site, make it attractive by saying there's going to be a future business activity, or that we might be using you later as a supplier for something, just so that they have some kind of reason to come in and update that profile information. Otherwise, if there's no incentive, they might just ignore that invitation to register and never register. And so speaking of that, we also recommend that you onboard your suppliers in waves. And so start with the most crucial and work your way to the less essential suppliers. That way you're not asking, you know, if you have 3,000 suppliers on your site, you're not asking all 3,000 of them to come register at once. You break it down into smaller sections so it's easier to manage. Okay, so any questions before we start the demo?
Randy, we do have questions here, but if you like, we can go ahead and hold on to it until Q&A. There are a bunch that came in. Would you like to go ahead and answer now, or should we go ahead and just keep it till Q&A?
Okay, we can wait until after the demo.
Okay.
Oh, great. So let me just get logged in here. Got logged out to event activities. And for some reason, my login screen is in Spanish, but the rest of it's in English, so we're good. Okay, give me 1 second. All right, so the first thing that we mentioned is one of the things that we want to do is to customize those email templates. And so in order to do that, we need to know how to do that. So we're going to go to Manage, and then we're going to go to Administration. So we can find those project email templates so that we can customize the emails that are going to be sent to our users when a supplier registers, so that we know what we need to do. So inside of here, I'm going to go to Project Manager. And then inside of Project Manager, I have Project Email Template. This is going to open up a window that's going to show you every single email that the system sends that is possible to configure. It breaks it down by project type. So right now we can see that we've got sourcing requests, sourcing projects, Supplier Workspace, Supplier Qualification Management Project. These are all of the different project types that we have customized messages for. What you're going to do to find the message that you want to customize is to go into the All Applicable Types folder. Inside of here, we're going to find messages relating to organizations. These are going to be the ones that have to do with suppliers and registration and the emails that are sent. So here, you'd be sent to approvers when a supplier self-registers. So this email notification is the one that is sent to the approvers when a supplier has self-registered. It says a new supplier has self-registered. If you want, you can come in here, you can select this message, you can edit it, and we can choose what this message is going to say. So a new supplier has self-registered may or may not be helpful. So you can add additional information here, customize this message, and it just says a new supplier from organization, pulls in the organization name, and that it has registered with your company. That's the only information that it has. You can click on Add Email Template Token, and that's going to take you into add additional pieces of information. These are the types of things that you can add into it if you'd like. Otherwise, you can just type in whatever custom information you'd like to have. You can translate that into alternate languages as well. And that's going to help your registration process so that the emails are a lot more specific, especially when we start looking at some of the others. Send to approvers when a user updates an organization profile. You can change that so that it's more clear if you have supplier information and performance management. So it's definitely worth taking a look at these messages and seeing which ones you want to customize so that it makes more sense to the users that are receiving them. And then the next thing we need to do is basically we're ultimately getting to the point where we're going to register as a supplier. We're going to both self-register and create manually. So before we create a supplier manually, we need to make sure that it doesn't exist, right? Because we don't want to create duplicates. So I could very easily go to create supplier and start creating my supplier, but I don't know what's already out there, so I need to search it first. So what I'll do instead is I'm going to click on my magnifying glass and I'm going to choose suppliers and customers. This takes me to my search screen. This is where I can then search to see if an organization already exists. There's a couple ways that we can search. This very first box here is kind of like a Google search. It'll give you any term. So you could type in an ID, you could type in a word, you could type in anything, and it's going to search all of the fields on the supplier organization for that. However, what I'm going to recommend as a best practice, if you want to make sure that you're finding a duplicate, searching by the main email address is usually going to be the most effective way of doing that, and using the domain, because no matter what somebody creates the organization as with the name, it won't matter if we're searching by the main email address. For example, if I search at, I'm trying to think, let's use IBM as an example. I can do at IBM, and I can search for that, and that will return anything that has IBM, because I could have, the user could have created that organization as IBM, or they could have created that organization as International Business Machine. So if I only search IBM, I'm not going to see any instance of International Business Machine. Therefore, I could accidentally create a duplicate because of the name spelling difference. Whereas if I search by the main email address, it doesn't matter what I type in as the name, their email addresses will still be at IBM. So that's the best way that I can recommend to search prior to creating an organization, to make sure that it does not already exist on your site before you create another one. Okay, you can also use additional search fields, so it doesn't have to be the main email address. You can also use this drop-down to change to any other field that you're looking for. So if you want to find suppliers by commodity, or if you want to find suppliers by region, you can use those particular fields here as well to search by. But that's going to be your best way to make sure there are no duplicates. So we've searched, we don't have any duplicates, let's say. Now we can go ahead and create our supplier. So to manually create a supplier, it's going to depend on your permissions. If you're a supplier customer manager, you're going to have the screen like I do. So I'm going to click on create, and I'm going to go to supplier. On this screen, the first thing I want to point out is here on the approval status, I have the ability to switch this between approved or unapproved because I'm a supplier customer manager. If I were a supplier customer agent, this would be set to unapproved, and I would not be able to change that. If I'm a supplier customer user agent, I won't even see the create supplier option. I can't even get to this screen. So those are the 3 different levels of permission that we have. In order to manually create a supplier, which is what we're going to do, it results in a private organization we need to remember. So there's no link to the Commerce Cloud yet when we create this. So we'll just fill out the required fields, and the required fields here might vary depending on your site's configuration. So it's possible to remove the city and the address information, for example, so all you have to do is an organization name. It just depends on how your site is configured. So I'm just going to fill out this information. It will yell at me if I don't give it a state. And also, the system is smart, just so you guys know. So if you do choose a city and a state and you put in a zip code that's incorrect, it will know that. I was shocked because one time I didn't choose my state. I just left it as Alabama, and I put in a Pittsburgh zip code, and it said that that zip code was incorrect. So just make sure that your zip codes are correct. Otherwise, you'll get an error. And also make sure that you choose the country from the drop-down, and don't just type it in because it needs to be in a specific format. So if you don't see it here, this is going to show some recently selected values. If you don't see the one that you need, click on Search More, and it'll show you all the countries that are available, and you can choose the one that you want. So just leave that at United States. This main phone number field, it's just a text field, so it actually does not have to be a phone number. It's not going to check that it's valid, so I can just put a 1 in there, or I could put in an actual phone number. Hopefully the supplier actually would. Aside from that, that's the only information that is required for me to create an organization. All of these other fields, you can populate information in them if you'd like to, but once the supplier links to the cloud, they're going to complete their cloud profile, and all of these questions are going to be answered there in the Ariba network, and they'll sync from the Ariba network to your site. So when the supplier registers and links their account, all of these fields will populate if they've populated them in the network. Also, you can see the profile questionnaire down here. This can be helpful if you have a part of your internal process requires a person within your organization to respond to a question. For example, we have a question here about the supplier registration status. Question 2.2 is registration status, and it's got an asterisk here, which means it's actually required of me when I'm creating the supplier. If I try to create now, I click on OK, it's going to yell at me. And it's going to tell me that I need to provide an answer to question 2.2. So this is a good way if you have any questions that an internal person needs to answer. These can also drive questions to be added. So for example, I could say that this is a new registration, and the answer to that question could cause another section here in the SPQ to appear because of the new registration. So I might need to collect additional information from someone that's new versus a supplier that's already registered. So adding an owner-required question in the SPQ can be helpful for reasons like that during the registration process. So we'll say new, then there's nothing else that's required of me. So now I can click OK, and that's going to create my organization. Now this has just created an organization. I don't have a user yet. So if I were to go into a sourcing event right now and try to find Randy Test Organization and invite them into that event, I would not be able to find them. They wouldn't even return in the search results because there's no user associated with this account. Since there's no user inside of this supplier organization, I don't have any ability to invite them. So what I need to do now is create the user. I have to have an organization in order to have a user. So I can't create the user before I create the organization. So now that I already have the organization created, I can then go ahead and create my user by clicking the Create User button here under the users. And then here it's going to ask you to provide information about for the supplier, for the user that's going to be logging in. So not the organization, but the user that is a part of that organization. So on the General tab, I'll create a user ID. This should probably have a convention for this as well, whether that's going to be their email address, first initial and last name. However you want to do that, it should be the same each time. the supplier is not going to see this ID, and the supplier is not going to use this ID. This ID that you're creating is for you and your team members to be able to search for and invite the supplier to the event, because you're actually not going to be able to see the user ID that they use. And we'll explain that when we go through the supplier self-registration process in just a minute. So I'll provide the rest of the information. My email address, that's required. It is going to require that it be in that format. It can't validate that the email address is correct, but it will require that it's at something dot something. Same with the phone number here. It's just a text field, so I can put in whatever I want. I'm just going to put in a 1. And then also the important thing to know when you're creating the user, if you want to invite them when they're created. So I'm going to create this user. I can click on this invitation tab to determine if I want to send an invitation when the user is saved or not. And so this will invite them to the site if you check this box. So as soon as I click on the Save button, the system will generate a notification and send it to this user to say that they've been registered and that they can log in and complete their profile. That's going to depend on if you want to get that supplier in your site right away or if you want to first invite them to an event, because they will also receive a link to register if you invite them to an event as well. The ship to addresses and the billing addresses, these are not required for the sourcing solutions. You can add them if you'd like, but they're not required. And the groups will automatically give the supplier a suppliers group, and that is the only group that they need. So you don't need to touch any of these 3 tabs if it's not necessary. Otherwise, you just need general for the information to give them a user ID and their email address and phone number, and then the invitation if you want to invite them to the site or not. Once you've configured all of those options, click on Save. Can't do it because it already exists. So I already have a user called Arshlam, and I knew I did. So I need to create something different. So what's today? 790. Let's do that. Okay, so the user ID, as we can see, has to be unique. So I can't have more than 1 user ID. That is the same. So we'll save that. Now it should be okay. And now I've got a user inside of here. Now I can invite Randy Test Organization to a sourcing event to participate in an RFP. So that's the process of manually registering a supplier. You create the organization, and then they get a link to come register. So rather than you doing that part, I'm going to switch over to a different browser. Switch over to Internet Explorer. So my company is education. So I'm going to go to their realm and register. So I would provide the supplier, if I wanted a supplier self-register, I'd provide them with this link, education1. So that's my site name, supplier.ariba.com/register. This is going to take the supplier here. The first thing that they need to do is they need to create an Ariba Commerce Cloud account. If they already have one, there's a login button here where they can actually input their existing username and password. So it's possible that they will already have a Commerce Cloud account because it's the same account that they use for all of their relationships with Ariba. So if they have multiple customers with Ariba, they can use the same ID to access all of those particular accounts. So as the supplier self-registering, I'm going to do basically the same thing that we just did, manually creating the organization, except it's the supplier that's going to create the organization instead. So we'll fill out some of the required fields. I need to give it an address. Same thing, it knows the zip code. So if you leave it as Alabama and put in a Pittsburgh zip code, it will say, nope, that's not right. So we'll make sure to say Pennsylvania and then provide our zip. If you choose a country that is outside of the United States, city, state, and zip code will no longer be fields that are required. Okay, so this is company information. This is where the supplier is putting in the information about the company. It's just the name of the company and the address. Down here, though, where the supplier is going to create their user information. So I'm going to say phone, Then I'm going to uncheck this box because we'll see why in a second. I'm going to put in my email address, which is randall.schwalm@sap.com. But I already have a Commerce Cloud account that is randall.schwalm@sap.com. Therefore, I can't create it again because it already exists. So I can't use my email as my username. Most suppliers, if they are creating a new account, will be able to use their email as a username because the supplier does have to create their user ID in the format of an email address. It does not have to be their actual email address. It just needs to be in the format of one. So I could do something like randall@schwalm.com, for example, and that's my user ID. Then I'll create a password. And then we'll repeat that password. This language field is going to determine what language will be sent an email notification. And then down below, there's to tell us more about your business, but there's nothing in here right now, so there's nothing for me to do. The only thing I need to do now is to read and agree the terms of use and privacy statement. Once I go through that and check that box, I can then click on register. It's giving me this warning because my email address is at SAP, but my user ID is at schwalm.com. And so it just wants to make sure that the domain I specified does not match my company. So I'm just going to say yes. Most suppliers won't get that because their user ID is going to match their email domain. But after they register, the next thing they have to do is validate their email address. So the system is going to send me an email address, or send me an email indicating that I need to validate my email address. So we'll check for the email. Here it is, over here. So you get this email. This is action required, activate your account. So it says, thanks for registering. To complete, we need to validate your email address, so click here to activate your Ariba account. Normally, a supplier would do that. I have multiple browsers open, though, so I'm going to copy and paste my link. They provided you a link down here. Just simply copy it. And we'll go back to where it asked me to validate, which was one of these places. Hold on. Here. And then I'll just paste that link and go. And that's going to validate my email address and log me in. So because I'm self-registering, what I just completed there was my registration on the Ariba Commerce Cloud. Now what I'm seeing is what is being requested of Ariba Education, the customer. So these are the SPQ questions that are being asked specifically within your organization. So this is the part where the supplier is now registering on your particular site. In this case, the only question that's required is what our annual revenue is. So I'm just going to put in the number here. The supplier at this point on your site will show up as in registration, meaning it's pending them submitting the rest of the required questions before they can be approved for use. As a supplier, I'll complete all of my questions and then I click submit. I lied. I need to provide an answer to this question as well. What commodity I supply? So I'll select. And the supplier will go through here and select their particular commodity. I'll just choose this one for the sake of time. And then submit. So by clicking on submit, what this is doing now is the system will now send that notification that we looked at when we were customizing notifications to say a new supplier has self-registered. And at this point, they need to approve. If you have supplier information and performance management with the Supplier Workspace template, that approval can be configured to go to either the commodity managers of that particular commodity or to a specific region. However your organization needs, that can be configured with SIPM. Without SIPM, all of these supplier managers are going to be notified now to approve this particular organization. We can't sort of customize that approval flow without SIPM. Okay, so that is about it as far as the demo goes. So I think we can entertain some of those questions down the class.
Okay. We do have many, and we're probably not going to be able to get to all of them. However, after the webinar, I'll go ahead and, ask Randy to answer your questions. So let's go ahead and go from the top here. Hold on one second. I have to go ahead and pull it all the way up. Okay. So the first one is, can you provide best practice for duplicate check while self-registration is activated?
So that would be, self-registration always requires approval. So whoever your approvers are going to be should have it in their process to first search to see if that supplier already exists using the search method that I showed earlier, where we search by the email domain to see if any other supplier has that email domain that already exists in the site. If they do, if you do find an organization out there, you can reject that self-registration and reach out to the supplier to say, hey, you're already here.
Okay, great. And the next one is, supplier performance method is not applicable for new supplier added for organization. Is it correct?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Okay, the supplier performance method is not applicable for new supplier added for organization. Is that correct?
The supplier performance management?
Supplier performance management, yes.
Yeah, because, well, we can't really manage their performance if they're a new supplier because we don't have anything to compare to. We don't have any surveys, we don't have any events, we don't have anything already in Ariba to sort of measure their performance with. So with a new supplier, it's kind of difficult to have an SPM project because we don't really have anything to measure their performance on. Now, you can set up an SPM project on a new supplier and measure them against certain KPIs that your organization has as the starting point, but they would already have to be registered.
I see. Okay, great. The next one is, are there any benchmarks to compare supplier performance with their best-in-class peers?
So I think that would just be setting up an SPM project for those suppliers, but you can only do SPM projects for suppliers that you have in your site. So if these best-in-class suppliers are not your suppliers and you don't have an SPM project with them, it would just be a question of taking the performance results that you have inside of Ariba, exporting them out, and comparing them with what your other source for those best-in-class suppliers.
Great. Okay. The next one is, please confirm a link has been done between qualification and approval process of the suppliers.
So I think I know what you mean by that. And so I think that's referring to the qualification status, preventing suppliers. So for example, if their qualification status is anything other than qualified, they cannot be invited to participate in a sourcing event or a contract workspace. As far as I know, that's still not possible. The qualification status still does not have any impact on whether or not the suppliers can be invited to participate in an event. That would be more of an end-user training process to have them search for the qualification status of that particular supplier before inviting them to an event.
Great, okay. Randy, before we go on, we only have about 4 or 5 minutes left, and I'd like to go ahead and open up the poll. So,
okay. So I need to stop sharing, correct?
Yes, please. Okay. I am going to open up the poll here, and if you could go ahead and answer these questions, we would really appreciate it. It is now open, and you have 5 minutes to answer these questions. And meanwhile, let's go ahead and go on and continue with the questions that came in here.
Okay.
All right. Hold on.
Yeah. Hi, Randy. This is Devinder. I have a few questions actually on the supplier registration.
Okay.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. Right now we have SIPM implemented, and we have SAP system also. So and we have bulk loaded all our SAP suppliers into SIPM as approved suppliers. So, but right now what is happening is on those suppliers, like some of them are again self-registering in Ariba network. So that causing a duplicate record into SIPM. So we were wondering, like, when the supplier is self-registering in Ariba network, what is the check actually it is checking for duplicates?
In the Ariba network?
Yeah, in the Ariba network.
I don't know. Unfortunately, I don't support that product, but I can find an answer for you.
Sure. Yeah, because we tried to reach Ariba a couple of times, but every time we are getting a different answer. So we are exactly not sure what exactly, like, how it is checking for duplicates.
Okay. Can you just make a note of that so we can follow up after?
Okay. Would you please go ahead and send me your email address in the chat? And if you could go ahead and repeat your question here in the chat, then I can go ahead and record it officially. So if you could do that, I'd really appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah, I can type in chat. Yeah.
Okay, that would be great. Okay. So let's go ahead and go on to the next question here. Comparing SIPM with SLP, what's the difference between them when we register a supplier?
So the biggest difference between the two is that with SLP, there's no more self-registration. Suppliers can't self-register. It's all through a supplier request. It's a new type of project. So it's almost like comparing apples to oranges, to be honest, because it's a completely new platform, completely new system with completely different rules. So it's a very different world between one and the other. And currently, right now, if you currently have SIPM, there's no way to move your suppliers from SIPM to SLP. And so right now, it's its own kind of standalone solution, but it's very different from SIPM.
Okay, great.
Hey, I have a question. This is Netaji. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
All right. So I'm suit integrated, and I have suppliers in upstream, downstream, and the network. And I have the network suppliers adding their run-it-to addresses on the network. And is there a way I can integrate those run-it-to addresses? There are multiple of those, right? So can I integrate them back into SIM and then push them back into SAP/downstream from there?
Do you mean, like, so you've got, let's say, 3 records for one supplier organization? Is there a way for you to send them to SIM to kind of consolidate them and then send them back to
the ERP, SAP?
The ERP as 1 instead of 3?
No, I would like to send them as 3 into ERP.
I'm not sure I follow.
So
I just real quick, I do realize we're at the top of the hour, so I can stay on for a little bit longer to answer any questions. But any questions that aren't answered, we'll follow up via email afterward.
Okay. Okay. The poll will be closed in about 30 seconds here. So if you could just go ahead and answer all these questions, we really appreciate it. Okay. So Randy, would you like to go ahead and stay for this a while?
Yeah, so I want to at least continue answering his question or finding out more about it. But anyone else who needs to drop is free to drop, and we thank you for your participation and attendance today.
Okay, and also we will be sending out the slide decks, so you will have it for your reference. And the poll is closing in about 15 seconds. So thank you so much for participating.
Okay, so tell me more about your question. You still there?
He might have dropped.
Okay, so I have quite a few people on the line. So do you want to keep going through the question?
Okay, sure. We'll go ahead and keep going here. So the next question is, for the multi-stage SPQ, is it possible to link each of the stages to an approval workflow?
In the SPQ, no, because the SPQ doesn't have any tasks associated with it, so I wouldn't have a way to approve particular sections. But I could, if you do have SIPM, you can do that in a SQM project, a qualification management project. You could have different sections, and each of those sections could have, you could have approval set up on them to continue on to the next phase.
Okay. The next one is, if we have a document needs to be renewed every 3 years in SPQ, like a W-9 form, how does this be managed in Ariba?
So if you have supplier information management, your SPQ becomes a little bit more robust, and questions can have expiration dates. So when you create the question to ask for the W-9, you can actually set an expiration date on that question. So if it's valid for 3 years, you could say expires in 3 years, at which point when you reach that expiration date, the system will start sending notifications to the supplier to let them know that they need to come update expiring profile information.
Okay, great. And the next one is, if I am already using SAP SRM for supplier management and I want to migrate to Ariba SIPM, migration of supplier data and their onboarding, how it will be achieved?
That I don't know. The migration and integration is out of scope for the Best Practice Center. But what we can do is we'll take your email address and we'll get you into contact with the people that can get you an answer to that.
Okay. Yeah, I'll go ahead and take a note of this, and I'll go ahead and find out the email.
Okay.
I'll go ahead and let you.
Yeah, and we'll follow up after this so that we can at least get you to the right people.
Okay. Yeah, we still have about 50 more questions to go, so it might be easier to go ahead and just, follow up via email. So if Randy is ready, then we can go ahead and end this call. It's already 5 minutes past the hour. So thank you so much for joining us. And okay, Randy is available until 1:30. So if you have any questions for the ones that we have in the chat box, we can go ahead and follow up via email. If you have any other questions, please unmute by press *6, and so you can go ahead and speak up and go ahead and ask questions. Does anyone have any questions? Okay.
Hello.
Yes. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
We can hear you.
Yeah. Hi. This is Raghu, and maybe I asked the first question. Like, we have upstream, downstream put together, and we are not using the upstream so far. We are using only the P2P, and we are creating the suppliers from SAP. We're pulling the data from SAP and creating into Ariba P2P for requisition and ordering purpose. So now we wanted to enable the contracts module, and whether still we'll be able to use the same suppliers for supplier integration for the contracts,
Yes. So if you're suite integrated, whenever you create a supplier in P2P, that supplier is automatically created in upstream as well. So basically what happens is the way the suppliers are organized is in upstream, so in sourcing and contracts, we have what we call the common supplier. And that's just the organization itself. And that same common supplier exists in P2P as well. The difference in P2P is that you can also then have partition suppliers. And that's where you're starting to break out into the individual locations for those suppliers so that you can pay and invoice and do all of that stuff that I'm not super familiar with. But in what's common between the two is the common supplier. It's shared between P2P and sourcing and contracts. So if you have a supplier in P2P, that same common supplier will be available in contracts.
So yeah, the biggest problem what we have is the upstream supplier has many fields like the organization 1, organization 2, legal name kind of things. But those fields are not available for the downstream, it seems, because when we import the supplier organization profile, that import file does not have those fields.
Right.
So is there any...
Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so is there any way that I can import all those supplier information directly into upstream so that I can upload them and I can make them in consistence with what the business requirement is?
I'm not sure I follow you 100% on that because those fields, that you're talking about, the legal name and corporate name and alternate name and other name and all those other fields that they have in there for all the names of the suppliers, those are coming from the Ariba network profile. So when a supplier registers on the Commerce Cloud, those are the fields they have to fill out as part of the organization in the Commerce Cloud, but they're not required.
Okay. So do I need to again create the user account for all these suppliers which are already in our system to enable them for Ariba network?
Yeah, so if you want them to be logging in and answering those profile questions, there needs to be a user associated with the upstream common supplier account. So there is no user concept in P2P, right? You don't have users in there. But in contracts and in sourcing, there are users who log in and complete that profile information.
So, okay, like in the demo you have shown us creating a manual supplier and creating a user account so that supplier will get integrated with the buyer system. So is there any way that supplier can directly send a request to the buyer account to get integration?
So I think I'm not clear on what you mean by integration. So if a supplier, if your site is suite integrated, so you've got your P2P and...
Yeah, my question is, there is one supplier, we have his supplier organization profile in our system, but we don't have a user account. So can directly supplier can send a request for integration with the buyer account from Ariba network?
I'm still not sure I follow.
See, in the demo you've shown me to create the user ID and send a request to supplier for integration, right?
Right.
So is there any other way, like supplier can himself register to our system?
Yeah, so that's the second thing I showed you, where the supplier goes to customer site name.supplier.ariba.com/register, and they first create their Commerce Cloud profile by providing information about their organization and then creating a user ID for themselves. Then after they create that, it takes them to your SPQ question. That's the supplier requesting creation of an account. That's the supplier kicking off that registration process rather than you.
Okay. So, I mean, to make me more clear that if the supplier is already registered in network, so they'll just log in with the network ID. Otherwise, they'll again give their credentials and log in.
Right. So either way, if they're new to your organization, they might not be new to the Commerce Cloud. They might not be new to the Ariba network. They might have relationships with other customers. They still, though, have to register on your site. It's just whether or not they have to create that network account or if they are using their already existing network account.
Because the problem is we have the supplier organizational profile in my system, but we don't have the supplier's Ariba network ID.
Okay, right. So that's a private organization. So what you would do in that case is you would go to that organization in upstream and add a user. Like we created a user today. You would add a user to that organization and then send them an invitation. Then what that will do is that will link that user ID that you created to the organization record that you already have. And then when the supplier registers, they're going to register under that organization instead of creating a new one, because you sent them the invitation from that user ID that you created in their organization instead of them just coming to self-register.
Great. My last question. Sorry for many questions here.
Okay.
Can we import the user IDs as a bulk?
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible?
Yep, you can create users by default. If you go into your help menu, so if you're inside of your Ariba site and you go to, what is it, help center, I think now. When you go to that help center, there are a whole bunch of site administration templates that you can find, and one of them is the bulk user modification template, and that you can use to populate and then import into the system.
I'll go to that. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. Does anyone have any other questions?
Hello. I have a question.
Okay.
Sure.
Thank you. I was taking a look at the best practice on checking on suppliers' duplicates, and I was wondering then how the tax ID validation actually works when trying not having these duplications for suppliers.
So the tax ID validation is only going to be checking that particular field. So it'll look at that tax ID and see if there is another organization that already has that tax ID. But it's only on that tax ID.
All right, but how, I know that, for example, the supplier is supposed to register, and before you approve it, in case you have SIPM, it will show you a message that you cannot approve the supplier because it already exists on Ariba. So which will be the best practice in this case? To validate if I have a duplicate one on my system before creating, or asking the supplier to register, or to follow the tax ID? And if the last option, is the tax ID ready for every city on, for example, South America, or it only works for US?
So you would have to choose what the format of that tax ID is going to be. And the other thing is, not every supplier is going to provide their tax ID. So if you're looking for duplicates, the tax ID isn't always the best way to go, because not every supplier is going to have a tax ID listed. So you can have duplicates without a tax ID. You know what I mean? And so the best way, I think, to eliminate any kind of duplicate is to make sure that if it's a self-registered supplier, before they approve it, search for it to see if it already exists. Before they create it, search for it to see if it already exists. And it's really just going to be about the way that you search to make sure that it's a thorough search, to make sure that there's not already a duplicate out there.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any idea if there is any improvement to this tax ID validation in the near future, or are we supposed to always orient our client to tell them to find for duplicates the manually way?
As far as I know, I don't know anything about future plans with that and the issues with duplicates. So I would say it should be focused on training your users to search.
Okay, thank you very much for your time.
Sure.
Okay.
Hey, this is Nadeem. Okay. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so how do we identify the Ariba network suppliers in SIM?
Like, how do you identify which ones are already on the network and which ones are not?
Yes.
So that can be a challenge. We don't really have any way to know, like we can't really see if they're public or private in every situation. So some of the exports will tell you that if they're public or private. Really the best way if you're looking at an organization is there's the organization name field, and then there's also a public company name field. So when you're looking at the profile of any organization, it has those two fields. If the public company name is populated, that means it's linked to the network, because that public company name is what the supplier puts in as their name.
Okay, so public or private, we can identify, you're saying. Okay.
Basically by the public company name. Now, it's not foolproof, because it is possible that a user, if they're manually creating a supplier, they could type something into that public company name field. That is possible. It's not likely, but it's possible. So the best way, the easiest way anyway, to see if a supplier is public or private is to see if they have that public company name. And also, if you try to edit the supplier organization, you won't be able to edit any of the fields, because now the supplier has to do that.
Okay, all right. Okay, thank you. That helps. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay. Randy, I think that was the last question. I can go ahead and just say that.
Yeah, so Masayo has all the other questions that were sent through the chat, which she'll send over to me. I'll send out responses to those questions after the meeting, so we can make sure that everybody's questions got answered. But other than that, we thank you all very much for your time and for staying over a little bit to answer some of those questions and get some of that information out there for you. And we hope that you guys have a great week, and we see you next time.
Great.
Hey, thanks.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Bye.
Okay. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The leader has dropped from the call, and if the leader doesn't dial back in and rejoin, the conference will be terminated.